So we are here in a series of webinars that has been organized by New Generation IoT, an European funded project. This is one of the last webinar before summer holidays, which are already started in some countries of Europe. Today it's one of the main webinars because it's one of the main topic. We have the luck to have with us Hey Now, which come from US and has a lot of experience in artificial intelligence and societal impact of the artificial intelligence on our life. And so I leave the floor to Pasquale Annicchino for any further consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you very much to all the colleagues who have joined from Activity Group 5, from the IoT Security Cluster, and so on. But first of all, I would like to thank Amba, and Rashida, Richardson, which are connected with us from New York. Amba is the Director of Global Strategy and Programs at the Hey Now Institute, which Francesco mentioned before, and Rashida is the Director of Policy Research at the Hey Now Institute and a visiting scholar at the Rutgers Law School. So they have an incredible amount of expertise on all things related to AI and the social impact of the AI and law. So the Institute has done an incredible amount of research on it, but we decided to have a conversation with them because they have also participated to the consultation published by the European Commission on the AI white paper, which we already discussed in two separate webinars in the context of NJIoT. We recognized that there was a lot of interest from the people which interact with NJIoT, which are people involved in research projects, stakeholders from the wider law and community, or also other kind of social science scholars which work on AI. So we thought that we might have a slot to discuss what on the other side of the Atlantic they think about the work that the Commission is doing. It's a kind of external feedback on it, which I think it's very relevant. And therefore, I'm very happy to leave the floor to our colleagues from the Hey Now Institute. I think that Amba will speak first and Rashida will speak second. So Amba, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you, Pasquale. I'm going to start with a brief introduction. I mean, we've heard a little bit about AI now, but to explain a little bit more what our orientation is towards these issues and the kind of work that we do, so that you can better understand where our submission comments come from and why we chose to engage in this consultation that was happening primarily for a European audience. So to start with, AI Now, as was mentioned, we are a research institute at New York University. We conduct both research and what we would call advocacy on the social and political implications of artificial intelligence and similar forms of data-driven technology. And I would say that our kind of overarching objective or goal is that these technologies are only used if they are just, equitable, and accountable. And so we try to address or kind of capture the social harms raised by AI and raise awareness about these social issues through a combination of methods. And Rashida will say a little bit more about this shortly, but we do it through robust research, through community engagement, as well as through key policy interventions. And most of these are focused within 4 core areas. So we work on rights and liberties, we work on labor and automation, on bias and inclusion, and on safety and critical infrastructure. So, I mean, I mentioned policy interventions, and since today we're talking about the EU white paper, I thought I'd say a little bit about why an organization like ours, based in the US, chose to engage with this consultation and why we are going to continue to be engaged with it. So I think the EU white paper, from our perspective, marks a very important milestone in shaping AI policy. Now, in some senses, as all of you have know because you've talked about this white paper, it sounds like multiple times by now, but it commits to very little. So it's very, very far from the black letter. It's not as if this is the only instance that feedback will be taken. If anything, it appears that this is quite early on in a much longer process of policy making around AI. But at the same time, we think this really is the critical moment where, similar to data protection, the core frame from which AI is regulated is determined. So for the kind of, the last decade or perhaps longer, you could argue that data protection was the dominant frame with which technology projects were regulated. And we think that now is that kind of tipping point. Will it be algorithmic accountability? Will it be ethics? Will it be risk-based, assessment? These are crucial questions that will determine how these technologies are regulated, not just in Europe, but all over the world. And I think I brought up the GDPR because I've worked globally, and I think there are more than 100, and I think the count is something at like 140 national laws that are, if not entirely borrow, but really are influenced quite heavily by the text of the GDPR and the pre-existing directives. So I think there's an opportunity or a promise of global impact. At the same time, it's really important, I would say, on Europe to get it right in some senses because of the kind of precedent that they might set. I'll say a little bit more before handing the virtual mic to Rashida, and that's that, to say a little bit about what has been our position on AI more generally. And I think to start with, and this is something that you'll see in advocacy and research organizations across the world. We're not unique in this, but we've really been trying to, shift narratives away from very techno-utopian understandings that AI can either solve all social problems, or even more that AI is some kind of magic that will immediately bring efficiency, security, and safety. And kind of, I think our first line of attack has often been, what do we actually mean by AI? Can we disaggregate what the particular kind of automated process is? What is the decision making that's being replaced? What is the particular sector? So really, I think I would say at the first stage, a lot of the evidence gathering that research institutes like ours have done has been to try to, get away from the big picture, capital G, global AI ethics debate and talk about more specific local impacts and more specific applications. And then the second is to start asking, what are this idea that, AI solves all problems. I think we come back to ask, okay, if it's efficiency, if it's safety, if it's security, then our question would be efficiency for whom? What does holistic safety actually mean? And who is more secure, and which communities, and particularly systematically discriminated communities, are left more insecure as a result of these technologies, whether it's facial recognition or predictive policing. So this is just to give you an example of the kind of provocations that we offer to some of the justifications that I would say are pretty standard, both in the commercial and the government sector when it comes to promoting AI. And I'll end by just a note on the kind of global versus local. I think that, like I said, what we're saying is not unique. It seems as if there are organizations all over the world that are gathering evidence to really say that any AI strategy needs to be grounded in its social impacts, and that there is a need to draw red lines. So in some senses, I would say that we've reached a certain kind of global, I wouldn't say consensus yet, but it seems as if there are core issues, there are patterns that are emerging again and again when it comes to AI applications, particularly when it's in sensitive social domains. And at the same time, I think to get to these questions has required really locally specific advocacy and research that really understands local context. And one more thing is that we often take a call to democratic values for granted. Another part of our work, I think, is to acknowledge that the language of advocacy will not look the same everywhere. It might be fundamental rights somewhere, it might be social justice somewhere else, it might be a completely different language that doesn't really rely on rights or justice at all, depending on the political context. So hopefully, I think today we can tease out a little bit the comparative learnings that are available, both comparing the EU to the US, but also to the rest of the world. And I will now hand it over to Rashida, who has led some of AI Now's most impactful interventions, to just say a little bit about the different strategies that we take to do our work before we get into the substance of our submission.
Yes, so before we talk about our submission, I think it's important for me to give some context for how our perspective that Amba just described has been informed. And we're an interdisciplinary research institute, so even though Amba and I's training is more in the law, we have colleagues who have CS backgrounds, computer science, that being communication studies, science and technology studies, historians. And I think those different perspectives allow us to dissect and understand issues through a more comprehensive lens. But in addition to performing research, we try to make sure our research is responsive to what's happening on the ground. So we engage in public education work, and I mean that for the broad public. So some of our public education work is targeted specifically at policymakers and helping them understand more the domain realities of certain AI applications. Some of our work is targeting the advocacy community as well as community members who simply want to better understand the technical aspects of these technologies, and also using those relationships to learn more about what's happening in specific domains. So a great example is that 2 years ago, we released a algorithmic accountability toolkit, which was targeted at advocates who work on these issues and included not only explainers and FAQs for general technical terms, but also guidance on how to fill out a public records request. So if you're either an advocate or even an individual who may have been harmed by the use of an AI system, how do you actually find out what's going on in your government when you've never filled out a report before? So trying to fill the gaps in information as well as resources for those communities. And then finally, we engage in different fronts of advocacy. So we provide comments as we did, which we're about to discuss, but we also provide legislative testimony to different governments globally. And we've also participated in a number of different forms of legal challenges over the years, including a Supreme Court case here in the United States, as well as local challenges, one being earlier this year at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which was dealing with the use of risk assessments in the criminal justice sector and the racial bias produced by those uses. And we use all of these different facets of work to both inform where we see openings for research, so trying to identify problems that are not very well explained, or even parts of issues that are not speaking the right language. So the legal community may be having one conversation about the application of Gdpr or certain civil rights or human rights frameworks, but the technical community is focused on audits or more technical approaches to the problem. So how do we bridge that gap and allow these conversations to be together and try to find comprehensive solutions that's not relying on any one form of knowledge or any one form of solutions? And I think you'll see that as we go through our comments, that this type of view of problems and how to think more holistically and see AI as a socio-technical issue really comes through in the critiques and also arguments that we make.
Great. Pascal, we were thinking of going right into our comments presentation. Did you want to come in before that?
Yes, I'm back. I think that we can do a first round. I actually have a first question for both of you, which might kick off the conversation. I mean, I have been teaching and doing research in the US, and I mean, seeing what is going on in Europe and the US, of course, we are now all familiar with the Schrems II decision, which, I mean, we have debated everywhere last week in Europe. So probably also many of the people who are in the call today have been participating in webinars and so on. So what are, from your kind of perspective, the most important striking differences of the European approach vis-a-vis the American approach to this topic? It's for both of you.
Yeah, how about this? I think maybe Rashida, we can flag it as we speak, because yeah, I don't think I have like a clear answer for you right off the bat.
I can actually go.
But if you want to go, yeah.
I'll give a quick response, and then I think some of the comments that we're planning to discuss will also help delineate these issues. I think there's a few different things going on. One, in Europe, I think because Europe has been a little bit more proactive in regulation, so there's data protection laws, the data framing has been more prominent in Europe, and we'll talk about that more in our comments. Whereas in the United States, the approach to data and tech issues generally is one that the United States has been very slow on, and that most of our current protections come from Supreme Court cases, and many of them are not very up to date. So, and the last sort of federal laws that we had passed on data protection type issues were in the 1980s. So this is not necessarily something that the US has been proactive on the federal and national level, but locally there's been lots of advocacy pushing for bans of facial recognition or moratoriums, or even creating commissions and bodies to look at government use of automated decision systems and AI. So I think what we're experiencing more here, and this is kind of what globally people are looking at, is what can happen on a national level if there's so much activity that's also divergent on the local level here. Can we have a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach, which tends to be more of the European model? And I think over the next couple of years, and why these conversations need to be global, is we're going to see how different countries evolve in treating these issues, and whether they're willing to shift completely from prior approaches or willing to take up a new approach.
Thanks, Rashida. In the meantime, I have shared in the chat with the participant the text, again, the text of your submission to the commission, because there might be people who had not seen it before. Will you guide us through some of your main recommendations? So maybe we can pinpoint at some specific issue that you are flagging there.
Yeah. So I'll start and then hand it over to Rashida, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to start with a kind of big picture issue, and that is just trying to understand to us what the white paper represented. In some senses, was a very unique policy document, which both tried to put forward an enabling policy, industrial policy framework to promote the industrial development of the European AI market, as well as, and at the same time, a restrictive regulatory framework to ensure that this development is in accordance with fundamental rights. So on the first hand, and I say that this is unusual or unique because usually the conversation about your AI industrial strategy and how to boost investment and how to boost the SME growth and create competition, these usually happen in very separate documents. And in some senses, I think it is a promising element, and it's a good lesson for us in regulatory policy to not divorce these conversations about the economics and the market drivers of the AI space from the conversation about regulation. So that, I would say, is on the positive. I think it's interesting and important that the policy paper tries to address both. On the first hand, they talk about kind of data sharing zones, creating centers of excellence, government support, both financial and otherwise, for creating innovation hubs, and what is the kind of financial commitment that will take over a certain time period horizon. All of this is, I think, critical in some senses, because there is no doubt the centralization of market power with the same handful of internet companies is definitely being replicated in many ways in the AI space. the global distribution of production and particularly of wealth that is emerging from this industry is also concentrated in many ways in Silicon Valley. And so I think the conversation about decentralizing this market is definitely an important one. On the other hand, I think there's a very slippery slope, and unfortunately, I think the Commission falls into that trap several times in this paper, to moving from saying there needs to be more competition to sort of replicating the same idea that we are all in an AI race, and therefore the answer is definitely more AI for AI's sake, because all countries, all nations, and all economies are competing in this hypothetical or mythical AI race. And so even when the Commission does talk about regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks, if you read closely, their justification is that it will eventually lead to greater uptake of AI. So they say, we want to give citizens confidence to use AI applications, and therefore we want to put in place rules. And I think this is not just a theoretical point. I think it's an important principal point, which is that regulation should not be viewed as merely instrumental to making sure that more AI is used. In fact, I think, and it'll be clear from our comments and the comments of several others in this space, that really this is that key point to determine which AI applications, which technological futures are worth pursuing in the first place, and which should be impermissible, which should not be allowed, and what is the level of democratic control that is required to make these decisions of what is used and what is not. So I think just as a starting point, I'll summarize by saying that while it's important to not divorce the conversation of industrial policy from regulatory, I think that what happens as a result is that there is a sort of uneasy balancing act between the two, which most often, and in this paper we see it in a few places, yields to kind of vague regulatory suggestions in the hope that any call for rules or regulation will be then seen as a strategic disadvantage for the industrial policy. And so we urge the European Commission to actually demonstrate global leadership here and go beyond kind of the measuring industrial progress solely in terms of AI adoption, and instead kind of pioneering a more evidence-led approach that investigates social impacts, that is not afraid to put red lines on certain kinds or complete bans or moratoriums on certain kinds of technologies which have proven harms, particularly against communities that are inevitably likely to bear the risk of these harms. So yeah, I'll conclude that first point here. We give a series of examples, I think, of particularly of AI systems that are being used in the public sector. And so in the Netherlands recently, a public benefit algorithmic decision system called Siri was successfully challenged, both for privacy and equity concerns. But we've seen several examples of this, and I think particularly in the US of where algorithmic systems have resulted in wrongful benefits termination. They've resulted in exclusion from care. The predictive systems that have been used in the childcare systems have actually been, there is evidence that they might have actually led to high-profile kind of deaths of children, which the technology failed to identify as high risk. So I think there is a kind of a laundry list, a growing list of examples where the use of AI in the public sector in particular has had really serious rights implications for citizens and for their rights and their opportunities. And those are the areas where we would like the EU to not just promote AI for the sake of it, but demonstrate leadership on where red lines might be drawn. And the examples that we give are predictive policing, child welfare, predictive analytics, pre-trial risk assessment in the criminal justice system, and kind of public benefit or public welfare decision systems. I think kind of as a second point, because we've talked about the GDPR already quite a few times, there is an uneasy feeling among privacy advocates really all over the world that the AI space or the AI market is often being used as a reason to say two things. One, to say that data protection has become outdated, so we need a new law. So, this law is therefore no longer applicable and we need to move to the next thing. And in some ways that kind of, erases a lot of the hard work of the last few decades. But on the other hand, there's also the claim that AI is should not be restricted by regulations like data protection, because they assume certain restrictions on collection or purpose limitation, which really won't work in the context of AI. So to say that not only are they outdated, but they're also unworkable, and they are unnecessary constraints on the AI system, on the AI marketplace in general. So here, I think our main point is to say that, and we've argued this extensively in our submission, both to the European Commission, but also to the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, that is also doing a similar inquiry right now, to argue that we actually we think there is a harmonious interpretation of both the general data protection regulation, but more generally of privacy law with AI systems, that they can be very important in introducing reflexivity when it comes to the use of personal data in these systems. And so, saying that we need to start from scratch would definitely be a harm. At the same time, what we've argued is that the data protection framework undoubtedly has certain limitations when it comes to some uses of AI. And I would say there's again here, we've done a detailed paper on what these limitations are when it comes to data protection, but to list a few of them. One, the threshold being personal data is a very shaky one. It's a shaky one in general, but when it comes to AI systems, the distinction between personal and non-personal data often breaks down. And often sensitive inferences about people are based on non-personal data categories. They're also based on group categories rather than individual categories of, individual inferences about people. And so the lens itself seems to obscure and can sometimes create loopholes around the most, we would say, harmful or pernicious uses of AI. So that's one, and I think that we've seen those examples again bear out a lot in public welfare systems or criminal justice AI systems. And then more generally, we've argued that the frame of privacy is a useful one, and it can go, it can go far in addressing risks of data confidentiality and data security and unauthorized data disclosure. But the harms of AI that we have, seen evidence of in the last decade go much beyond privacy. They do go to discrimination. They go to the hypervisibility of certain communities. And a lot of it has to do not so much with what data is coming in or going out of the system, but much more which are the actors that are using it, what is their objective, and what are the impacts on particular groups and communities. And so interestingly, if you look at in the US, if you look at recent proposed legislation like the Algorithmic Accountability Bill and lots of the legislation that's come out to regulate biometric or facial recognition systems, you'll see that the threshold condition is no longer what is the kind of data that is being used in these systems. That is made immaterial in these legislation. Instead, they ask, does this algorithmic system impact people's rights, liberties, and legal entitlements? If it does, then that is the threshold condition for the laws to apply, and not the kind of personal data threshold. So I think already the learnings from data protection and the kind of limitations of data protection frameworks are being carried forward into algorithmic accountability laws. And we recommend to the EU that these, again, that you preserve and in fact continue to build on the enforcement of the GDPR. But as we look to what is required next, we also learn from the kind of shortcomings that have become apparent through the implementation of data privacy legislation. And I'll stop there and pass the virtual mic to Rashida.
Yes, many thanks. I will have, of course, many questions. If we have time, I will comment on it because your presentation was so rich. But let's give first the floor to Rashida.
Thank you. So just to segue off of the last point Amba made, I'm going to highlight a few other arguments that we made in the paper, one being the need to shift how we're defining these systems. There's a tendency to focus on only the technical functions and the capabilities of a system rather than focusing on impact. And I think the laws that Amba just listed is showing that there's a shift to recognizing that impact should be the central focus in trying to understand both how these systems affect society, but also how should they be regulated. And just to broaden that point, there's a tendency to only focus on the impact on legal rights and not understanding that that can have different sort of values in different jurisdictions, but also even within a society, those rights can evolve over time. So it's also important to broaden how we view impact and actually looking at what the systems do, looking at how they may infringe on the ability of a person to access certain opportunities, which is something that's not traditionally a right that's understood in many legal frameworks, but it can have long-term effects on someone's life. And then I also think the reason why we need to pivot away from just technical definitions of AI, automated decision systems, and other terms that are typically defined in legislative documents is that there's a disconnect between having a very precise technical definition and those who are actually implementing the laws. And often there's a lack of technical understanding within government. So I've even experienced this with trying to file public records requests where I can define something specifically about how it works, explaining how a predictive analytics system functions, yet the person looking at those documents within government has no understanding of what I'm saying. So if you don't have adequate understanding and training within government, the over-reliance on technical terms can actually infringe a person's ability to access information and understand how they're being affected by systems being used within government. Another argument that we make within the comments is sort of pushing back on the approach of risk classifications, which is becoming a popular way of regulating. And that's understanding that different sectors generally have different impacts on a person's life. So obviously in criminal justice and law enforcement, there's a level of coercive power that the state and government is allowed to have, which therefore can have significant impacts on a person's rights and ability to function in a society. But I think creating arbitrary risk classification poses two problems. One, they tend to flatten the nuance and complexities of different approaches or even different applications of AI. And second, it doesn't really delineate or see the difference between uses in different domains. So predictive analytics as a system has different impacts when used in criminal justice, when used in education, and when used in child welfare, and not specifically understanding those sectoral impacts tends to overlook certain harms and risks that can be posed by these systems. And it can also tend to reduce systems to one sector's understanding of how it's being used. And the other main problem too is that by focusing on the most obvious risk tends to eliminate or even make legally permissible uses that are extremely harmful. So as Amba mentioned, we've been calling for more attention to the uses of AI and other automated systems in child welfare and welfare benefits allocation, because we've seen the harms of these systems in use both in the EU and in the United States, but traditionally those are not sectors that are considered for high risk categories. It's usually limited to criminal justice, which does have direct impacts on one's rights and liberties, but you can equally argue that certain interventions forced through AI, the use of AI systems, can have long-term impacts on a family's life, and especially when it's used in the education system, it can completely derail someone's trajectory in their future, depending on how a system is used. So what we call for is to have more domain experts engaged in discussions to both examine how different AI applications may be used in government, but also providing that context of how it's used within these sectors to understand the differences in risk and harm posed by these systems. And then finally, another area that we highlight as an area ripe for intervention, which we've written about in several documents, is the procurement process, and that many governments procure these technologies relying on laws that are very outdated or do not necessarily account for how technology works today. So you may have someone who's dealing with a contract that's used to dealing with mass software purchases of Microsoft Office, but may not understand the technical differences between a software system like Microsoft Office and a predictive policing system. And especially when we're dealing with deep learning and machine learning systems, understanding how government information is essentially becoming part of that product and then able to be profited by third parties rather than government, and what happens when such sensitive information is essentially becoming a product that's for sale. So we've made several recommendations both in our comments and then more before our comments, we released a report called a shadow report of the New York City Automated Decision Systems Task Force, where we provided a lot more granular recommendations about modifications to be made in the procurement process. And over the next year in my visiting scholar role at Rutgers, I'm actually going to be expanding on this work and looking at the differences between procurement processes in the EU and United States and trying to identify both reforms, but also practical policy changes that needs to be implemented in government to sort of modify and amend towards the types of purchases that are actually being made in government. And finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the comments that would have been made by our colleague Roel, who was unable to join today. But Roel does a lot of work and definitely helped with the comments on issues of safety and vulnerabilities with critical infrastructure. And one of the main arguments that we try to make is understanding AI as a socio-technical system, which we've already mentioned, but trying to expand how we think about notions of safety, which traditionally has been looked at through mostly a technical lens, and trying to bring in a more holistic view of how to think about safety, its social implications, its different impacts, and also understanding different notions of safety, not simply does it work or not work and who is harmed by that, but what are actually the long-term implications of decisions made or uses of AI. And since I'm probably not going to do the best job at summarizing his points, I will just direct you to some research that better explains. So earlier this year, or maybe even last year, and we can post these in the chat, Roel co-authored a Medium post that went into great detail discussing the climate impacts of AI use. So not looking at climate change and how AI can help it, but more what are the actual on-the-ground impacts on climate change that are a byproduct of the expanding use of AI, and that's looking at the amount of power and resources that are used just to run these systems, and what is the long-term effect if the goal of so many governments and even the public is let's expand AI use, but we're not adequately understanding the actual consequences of those uses in all functions, especially on the environment. And then the second is this fall, AI Now will release a report about safety and vulnerability authored by Roel that's going to cover some of the arguments of how to think more expansively of how we think through safety and what does it actually mean to look at safety issues through a socio-technical lens. What is necessary for those from more technical backgrounds to understand, and also those from legal backgrounds creating laws to essentially regulate these issues in order to address the concerns highlighted. And I'll stop there so we can do Q&A for the last couple of minutes.
Many thanks to both of you. It's so rich. I want to flag just one thing, which starts from the kind of discussion and tension that Amba saw in her kind of opening claim. This kind of tension between the competition narrative and the kind of national interest narrative. So how do you see this discussion which is developing in Europe now on the so-called data sovereignty? Because I mean, this is definitely part, I mean, you didn't use that word, but was clearly there probably in kind of the back of your mind. So I wanted to go back to it because it's I think at the core, both in the sense of from a policy perspective, but also from a technical perspective. Because I mean, the old discussion that we are seeing in Europe, for instance, on data spaces, and now you create the data space that's exactly about that. So that what seems to be a technical discussion is in reality a very deeply political discussion. So how do you see it from your kind of observatory?
Yeah, so interestingly, I've actually been doing a paper with a colleague, Sam Sachs, on comparing data sovereignty ideology in Europe, China, and India. And just, it's interesting because that terminology in China, they call it cyber sovereignty, but it's become much more prominent, both explicitly and, like you're saying, implicitly in a lot of the policy that's coming out. So I'd say a few things. The first is, it seems like often the claim of data sovereignty, it's a big one. It's about challenging the hegemony of Silicon Valley in the tech industry and now specifically in the AI space. But if you kind of scratch the surface, mostly the policy proposals, the hard concrete policy proposals that you hear are on data localization and on restricting cross-border data flows. If it's not that, for example, Europe has said that they do support and they endorse the free flow of data with trust, so with GDPR restrictions. So if they're not asking for data localization, then at the same time, they are saying that they do want to create non-personal data zones, that they want to create these. And like I said, like these distinctions between personal data is a highly regulated zone and non-personal data is a zone where we will cultivate innovation, to me is a somewhat superficial understanding, not just because these distinctions break down, but because from what we've learned from the open data movement, there are also, if the challenge is to try and capture value of, or try and break market power, then it seems like to me the way to get there is not to create an artificial separation between types of data and then create your policy framework based on that. I think similarly with data localization, and I've argued this in the Indian context extensively, is that it is not clear what that one step will do. So, okay, you will make sure that all personal data of Indians is stored in India. What next? How do you move from that to creating a vibrant ecosystem, particularly when there are such, I would say that there are such strong dependencies on some of the largest AI companies just when it comes to computational infrastructure. So everyone, including probably several governments, are reliant on AWS for carrying out basic computational to carry out their own projects. And we saw this with the COVID-19 response as well, that even the UK government came out and said that their dashboard, their COVID response was going to take the help of Palantir, of Google, and of Amazon, and of Microsoft to just get off the road. So to answer your question, I think that there is a big existential question of competition and market power and what is the best way to approach that. But I think that the current narrative around data sovereignty and the proposals like data localization or non-post personal data are both dangerous, and to me they aren't really getting to the root of the problem.
Thank you. That was clear and very straight to the point. I would be interested in reading your paper, frankly, as I think many people. I don't know if this has been already published, but I will drop you an email in case it's available in a draft version, because it sounds really fascinating to me. So let's finally give the floor to some people who have been with us to see if there is any question or answer. So you are free to intervene from the floor. Just state your name and ask your question to the speakers. Probably, I don't know if maybe let me call on somebody, because we've been discussing. Mario, I think if he's with us, I think he might have some comments there, probably. Mario?
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
yes, I am really interested in the title of the seminar. And I think I have two remarks. The first one, we are talking about artificial intelligence. The number of applications is huge. We are talking about data protection, but we need to talk also to add personal data protection. In this case, we are talking about GDPR. Then we need to protect data, and we need also protect the personal data. And I understand very well that there are different kind of applications that we don't need to protect the data, and some ones is extremely important to protect the data. This is the goal of the GDPR. In the GDPR, there are two very important concepts: the concept of consent that you need to provide a consent if you want to allow the people to use the data. And this could be a big issue for the big exploitation of artificial intelligence for some applications, but this is really necessary. For another side, in a previous webinar, we have learned that we need to make the data protection very, very early in the value chain. And this could be done through anonymization. Then technology and use cases are really related. Then, for instance, in my side, I work in the Gdpr. For instance, in the medical applications is really important. I see the interest to have artificial intelligence to this kind of applications because you need a huge amount of information if you have valuable resource. But also I understand what we don't need every time to do this artificial intelligence in the website. And that means artificial intelligence in the cloud. What I push in also is to move for many things in the edge. That means we can use artificial intelligence in the edge with extremely powerful, very distributed, and we can gain a lot of things. One of the things is privacy. We can gain in efficiency. We can save power, many things like that. Then I think it's really interesting what you mentioned, but we need to make the differentiation, applications, what is the kind of data that we need to use, and what are the business behind. Because I would see one of the big difference between Europe and USA. USA is business driven. In Europe is more regulation. We pay attention of the protection of the people. When you talk with the people here in France, for instance, people is really concerned about what will happen with the data of them. Then really they need the consent, they need to provide the use of this data and how this data will be used. I don't know, it is one of my comments.
Thank you, Mario. Let's see if Amba and Rashida want to react to that. Because then we have also one question in the chat. Maybe Shavek can explain it just to make it clear and simple. But let me first go to Amba and Rashida if they want to react to Mario's comments.
No, I think what you said made a lot of sense to me and resonated with our point, which is that we think that existing legal frameworks should definitely be strengthened, and there's a long way to go in enforcing existing law. And so we shouldn't try to, go back on that progress. I will say that I think the focus on protecting data in some ways has been it's been inadequate to deal with the kinds of concerns that are coming out with AI. And I'll give just one example is that we keep hearing about systems that are making government decisions like welfare benefits, or you can think about bail or other forms of criminal justice, ADS. And the question there is people are not worried about where is my data going? Is my data secure? The question they're really asking, and the prime, sorry, I'm so sorry about this. Just 1 second. Yeah, sorry. So I think the question that they're asking then is, what is the impact of these systems? How was this decision made? What was the logic of the system? So I think moving away from a focus just on data to a focus on understanding how decisions are made by systems seems to be like a core change that will be reflected in AI regulation. Rashida, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to highlight one minor point about consent, and I think that raises I agree with you, but I think one of the challenges and issues that we have to start figuring out is how does that work practically, understanding that there are power differentials in society. So how do you actually gain consent when not everyone has access to resources by which to provide consent, or generally or historically governments don't see the need to obtain consent from certain communities. So I do think a lot of these principles that should be embedded in our laws with dealing with AI are also challenging the way that governance has operated in a lot of ways globally. and are forcing us to have conversations about how do we need to rethink how the law functions to ensure that there's equitable access to rights or equitable expression of rights. And I think consent is one of those difficult ones of it is a necessary sort of benchmark to meet, but how does it actually work given how society works and how different governments work?
Thanks, Rashida. I don't know if
sorry, only one remark. Only
Yes.
one remark is, I said, I also mentioned anonymization. That means if we want to use data, should be anonymized, because for sure, for many applications, we need that. We need data. Like we can understand for epidemics and something like that, we need a lot of data. And it's the only way if everybody can contribute, but contribute with anonymized data. And this is key in GDPR.
Thank you, Mario. I don't know if Shavek wants to jump in. I think that also Ken has a question. Shavek and Ken, you want to speak so that everybody can listen? Maybe there are people who cannot read.
Oh, yeah. Hi, this is Ken Figueiredo. Thanks for taking the question. You mentioned earlier on, we were talking about the harmful applications of AI, and you described the role of regulation to prevent the deployment of such systems. Let's say hypothetically that that is not possible. What are the alternatives or fallback measures to offer protection?
So this is actually something that is part of a long-term research project I'm working on. And I think what we need is to reevaluate, like we need law commissions to reevaluate laws in every jurisdiction, because the reality is that many of our existing legal protections don't work for everyone. And and I think it would be misguided to continue to pursue reforms without examining how existing procedures or even protections work or don't work. So to give a more specific example, the work that I'm doing here is examining the use of anti-discrimination laws and civil rights laws in the United States, and how, if you look historically both at the intention of creating these laws, but also how they've been interpreted over time, they've actually served to harm the groups they were intended to help over time. And what happens when you rely on these legal frameworks as the sole protection of rights for all uses. So I think that currently we don't have many fallback measures or even alternatives for protections, but we need to systematically reevaluate how our legal frameworks are benefiting some and not others, and what are the changes that need to happen that complement more technical or other regulations specific to AI or even sectoral approaches.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I saw your comment in the chat. So I just wanted to say, on the subject of pushing back against facial recognition, we're just in the process of completing a report that compares facial recognition regulation globally, and the chapter on moratoriums and bans is very instructive, because what you read in the headline is like there's a ban, or there's a, the legislators have pressed pause on the use of these technologies altogether. But if you scratch the surface, it's actually a whole host of tools which are aimed, again, not at trying to tweak the technology or tweak the technical aspects of these systems, but ensure a more deliberative, democratic, and participatory process before they are allowed to be implemented. So maybe that means setting up a task force and making sure that that task force has representation from the communities that will be impacted, or from just more broadly a diversity of viewpoints. It might be that there should be no facial recognition until a law is passed using parliamentary process. So I think to me, it's not so much about saying ban X, Y, and Z technology as it is about putting in place, I would say, legal friction or participatory or procedural friction in the process of prior to when these systems are implemented. Like you're saying, in some ways the train has kind of left the station, but I think in many ways the point of moratorium legislation in particular is to try and get some of that time back and start with a deliberative process now that we know that there is proven evidence of harms.
And just to add to Amba's point, I think there needs to be more inclusive discussion, because often decisions about what is permissible and not permissible is made by a few people with vested interest in how certain systems play out, which limits our conversation about what types of systems should or should not be built. Because I think facial recognition and biometric technologies are the sort of focal point for now, but they're not the only harmful technologies in use. And I think when we don't have broader conversations about impact and about even how the creation of certain systems, even if never deployed, can still cause harm, then it limits our ability to have more robust discussion about what types of applications, functions, and uses should not be used in society, versus only focusing on those that are the most obvious or the ones that we know more information about. And I'll also say that where Amba and I are working on a paper, we're working on a lot of things that are relevant, but I think a paper that Amba and I are working on, and another paper that I'm working on with another colleague, while they're not specifically about what technology should be used or not used, I think they're going to help better understand how we should be thinking about systems, both in the design, acquisition, and use, to more critically examine whether they should be used at all, what type of regulations are the best fit if we decide that it is permissible for certain technologies to exist. And I think with a better framework for understanding how to evaluate technology, then we can have more robust conversations about where to draw red lines.
Many thanks to both of you. Before we close, I think that there is an issue to address as far as you can from Shavek. So let me go to the question that he wrote in the chat. On the topic, no, this is Ken. Any suggestion on paper specifically about the merit of rejecting technological solution, refusing to build, collect, deploy?
I think that's what we just addressed. Hopefully we addressed.
No, you have you can add in the chat some specific paper that
sure.
Yeah, or maybe you can send them to me and I can circulate in the mailing list that we have.
Yeah, let's do that. I'll sync with Rashida and then send you.
Yeah. Because then he developed the question in the second question he wrote. Okay, we are just at 5 now, so straight 1 hour precise. I thank both of you for this very rich conversation, really, and I hope that as you move forward with your researches, we can remain in touch, and on the chat base on a regular basis. I am myself personally quite often in the US, so we will see when they reopen the sky. I have also been teaching in the US, especially in New York, for 2 years at St. John's Law Schools, and I've been teaching European law in Queens there for a couple of years, spent some time there in New York. Francesco, I think that now it's for you the duty and honor to conclude the session as a co-organizer of the event. From the Istituto Italiano Privacy, Francesco Capparelli.
Thank you very much. I just have an input before closing up. I think that the regulatory framework and the GDPR, it's a possibility, an opportunity, not a boundary, not a limit. It's something that we can think that it can be useful to further for the next generations in order to have controls of their rights and their data. Only culture and control can provide freedom. So I suppose that somehow GDPR can be seen as a limit to the possibility to expand the use of artificial intelligence, but it's a sacrifice that we have to bear in order for the future generations. I suppose they'll remember us for that. So closing with this look to the future, I'd like to thank you all for participating to this webinar, and we look forward to organize another webinar, maybe with you, because it was very precious for us to have you. Thank you very much.